Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Terrell. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Justice Research Center, and I am so excited to have you here with us today. As you know, there's an election coming up, and today we have the honor of having the candidates for the Hennepin County Attorney Office to join us and discuss their vision for the future of prosecution. I am pleased to introduce our board chair, Andy Martens, who has been an incredible support to the development of the Minnesota Justice Research Center. As I will share just briefly, our mission is to transform the criminal legal system. And the way that we do that is through research, education, and policy development. The resources and support that Andy has given the staff at the Minnesota Justice Research Center in order to execute that mission is critical. And I'm so excited to have him lead our discussion today. And so with that, I will hand it over to Andy, and he can give you a few more details. Andy, if you need me, I'm here to support you throughout the event. But I'm excited to be centering the voices of folks directly impacted and thinking about the future of this very important office. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'll hand it over to Andy. Let's have a great conversation today.
Thanks, Justin. And again, thank you to all of you for joining, and particularly the candidates and panelists that we'll introduce as we go. As Justin mentioned, our goal for today is really to have a conversation. So this is not a debate. It's really a conversation trying to center the people who've been directly impacted, both victims of sexual assault, survivors of sexual assault, as well as people impacted by the criminal justice system. And we're very focused on bringing the voices of the community to this conversation as well. I did want to particularly thank our partner, Artika Roller from the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, who will be sharing some thoughts with us, as well as introducing a number of the panelists. For anyone interested in continuing legal education credit, that credit has been applied for. And if you just send us an email, we will make sure that you get all the information you need to receive that credit. For the candidates, again, thank you very much for joining. Please do your best to keep your responses to the questions relatively brief, 2 to 3 minutes. We would love to allow a little bit of interaction between the panelists and all of you. So to set the stage for the conversation today, I'd first like to introduce Professor Rachel Moran from the University of St. Thomas Law School. And she'll take us through some thoughts on the role of the county attorney, some criticisms that have been faced, and some research-based proposals that seek to address these criticisms. Rachel, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Justin. I'm excited to be here as well. I said yes to this event because it is so important to center the perspectives of people, both crime survivors and people accused of crime. Those are too often overlooked in our system. I want to start by apologizing for my voice. I'm getting over a cold, and so sorry for how I sound today, but bear with me. I came to Minneapolis 4 years ago. My background was as a public defender in Chicago, and a lot of what I did was represent people accused of violent crimes, and a lot of times children accused of violent crimes. And so I have seen the pain that crime causes to survivors of it, and I've also seen the pain that our legal system causes to people accused of crime. And I'm thrilled that we're hearing from those folks and not letting our system simply operate like a giant bureaucracy that ignores the most important voices. I'm really excited to participate, and I'm grateful to everyone who has agreed, including our 2 finalists for the role of Hennepin County Attorney. Thanks for being here today. I'm just going to provide about a 15-minute overview of what has historically been the role of prosecutors, how has that changed somewhat in recent years, and what are some of the major issues that the next Hennepin County Attorney is probably going to have to grapple with. For many years, prosecutors, the major selling point for almost all prosecutors nationwide, not just here in Hennepin County, was being tough on crime. That's how they ran for office. They ran almost exclusively on promises to punish perpetrators of crime. And they measured success largely by conviction rates and prison sentences. They did so with seemingly little concern for many years for the enormous increase in incarceration rates in this country and the horrific impact that mass incarceration has had on communities of color and especially Black communities. And certainly they're not the only people responsible for that. Our state and federal legislators were contributing to our skyrocketing rates of incarceration by passing laws that increased punishments and prison sentences for a huge variety of crimes. But prosecutors are in many ways the frontline warriors in the over-incarceration scandal because they're the ones who individually charge people with crimes and pursue convictions. As of 2018, the US incarceration rate was about between 5 to 9 times higher than the UK, Italy, or Germany, and a number of other European countries, 15 times higher than that of Japan. Although our prison population has dropped slightly in the past few years, we still incarcerate the highest percentage of our population, higher than any other country in the world. With that background, within the past 5 to 7 years, a movement has emerged of prosecutors running for election on platforms that are more nuanced than they were in the past. Some of those platforms involve reducing incarceration, looking for alternatives to imprisonment, and even refusing to prosecute certain offenses that may be on the books, but that where the prosecutors have determined that could cause more harm than good. These people have often styled themselves as progressive prosecutors, and they've been elected in cities across the country, including Philadelphia, San Francisco, New Orleans, Chicago, Boston, many others, and including arguably across the river in Ramsey County. There have been some data-based results that suggest that these models of prosecution work. To give one example, Prosecutor Rachel Rollins out of Boston, her office declined to prosecute a number of low-level crimes such as disorderly conduct and other misdemeanors, and found that there appears to be a correlation between that decision to stop prosecuting certain low level of crimes and actually reducing recidivism in the area, in part because the mere fact of being arrested or cited and forced to go through the process of attending court and defending oneself accused of a crime can actually destabilize people, reduce their social contact, have a damaging effect on jobs, schooling, etc. And so there have been some suggestions that progressive prosecutors are actually helping reduce crime. There's also been backlash, of course. There have been recall attempts and one successful recall attempt for progressive prosecutors who are being blamed for rising crime rates or a perception that they're not taking crime seriously enough. Regardless of what you think of the movement, I would say that one area we can probably all agree on is that it's created more nuanced conversations about what prosecutors are supposed to do. And today, prosecutors running for election here in Hennepin County and across the country understand that there are different approaches to prosecution, and we should be able to expect candidates to clearly articulate what their theory of prosecution is, what approach they would take in certain situations, and why. With that said, I want to highlight just a few current issues that the next Hennepin County attorney will almost certainly have to address. The first thing I want to highlight is how will they handle how their office creates or permits alternatives to traditional punishment. The Hennepin County Attorney's Office has experimented in the past and somewhat today with alternatives like restorative justice programs that allow survivors and people who are labeled as offenders to meet and talk through how those experiences impacted them. Hennepin County also has a diversion program today where people can, that allows people to stay out of the criminal system if they, for example, attend classes or participate in certain forms of programming. I'm going to share my slide for a moment. and show you what Hennepin County currently offers as diversion programs for adults. And I want to highlight that they offer this in property crimes and certain low-level drug crimes. And this is, I've actually pulled this from the Hennepin County Attorney's own, this is the information they provide about when they make diversion available. So it's low-level felony drug possession charges, property crimes of less than $5,000. And they also limit who would be eligible for it. People with prior felony convictions are not eligible. People who have gone through diversion programs before are not eligible. And charges that involve allegations of violence or possession of dangerous weapons are not eligible for diversion. Hennepin County also offers a juvenile diversion program that is somewhat more expansive. But one of the questions facing the next Hennepin County attorney is, how will they approach things like restorative justice or diversion programs, alternatives to traditional punishment that tends to end in jail or prison, and when will they make those things available? The next thing I want to highlight is issues of police accountability. So prosecutors work closely with police. Police are the investigators in their cases, and Hennepin County Attorney's Office has been under significant fire in recent months because of their failure to properly track police officers with histories of misconduct that could impact their credibility as investigators and witnesses. Some prosecutors' offices, just to give you a little bit of context for what I'm talking about here, track information about police officers with histories of misconduct on something called a Brady list. Really what that's designed to be is not required by law. It's just a tool that some prosecutors' offices use so they can keep track of information about police officers that might suggest the officers, they could be lacking in credibility, or there could be information that the prosecutors are required by law to disclose to defendants. One example of this would be an officer with a history of dishonesty. If you have an officer where a judge has previously found that they were lying about the way they conducted an investigation, or the way they searched someone, or an interaction, if a judge has found that the officer has previously lied about something, that's information that defendants would want to know in future cases and would want to use that to attack the credibility of an officer. The same could be said for an officer, for example, with a history of excessive force, like Derek Chauvin, who had previously used improper force on a number of people, sometimes to a criminal level. That's information that Hennepin County Attorney, I would say, struggles to collect and really doesn't collect well. And I'll show you, I'm gonna share my screen again and show, sorry, I gotta fix one thing, I apologize. Show you the results of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights' own report into this issue. So this is a report that the Department of Human Rights, an investigation that the Department of Human Rights released in April of 2002. And here's some information they had to say about Hennepin County and their tracking of police misconduct information. They say county prosecutors may be providing defendants with incomplete impeachment information, that neither prosecutors nor public defenders have the information they need to properly prosecute or defend a case, and that prosecutors sometimes choose to simply remove an officer from a witness list instead of producing evidence about that officer to the people charged with crimes. That's a problem. That's not a healthy way of conducting prosecutions. And the next Hennepin County attorney needs to figure out how they will handle that. Relatedly, in the area of police accountability, the next Hennepin County attorney is going to have to figure out a policy for how will they investigate police officers accused of crimes. In recent years, the Hennepin County attorney has shopped that out essentially to other offices, and folks have a right to know how will the next Hennepin County attorney plan to handle investigations of police misconduct. Next thing I want to talk about is sexual assault investigations. That's another yet another issue that there has been controversy about in the past. In September of 22, just last month, the Minnesota State Crime Lab acknowledged that they have a backlog of 6 to 8 months for testing of sexual assault kits. Minnesota as a state does not impose a deadline for testing these kits. Some states have 30 or 60 or 90-day deadlines for testing kits. Minnesota doesn't have one. And because of this backlog, those kits are taking far longer to get tested. Law enforcement agencies locally and statewide have been criticized for handling of sexual assault investigations, including but not limited to the Minneapolis Police Department. And the question for the prosecutor's office, this isn't all something that, obviously there are problems beyond the prosecutors and how sexual assaults are prosecuted. But what will the Hennepin County attorney do in addressing this backlog or in revamping the way sexual assaults are investigated and prosecuted? What concrete steps will they take to address this serious issue that has been going on for a long time? The last thing I will mention, a lot of people in Minneapolis and in other aspects of the county have raised concerns about perceived rising rates of violent crime. I want to first note that Minneapolis is actually experiencing a reduction in 2022 of murders and other violent crimes, which tends to get overlooked. But there are still many voiced concerns about rising crime rates and danger. We hear a lot of debate about what police departments can or can't do in reducing crime, but we don't hear a lot of conversation about what are prosecutors' roles in actually reducing recidivism. Is that part of their job, not just to prosecute crimes, but to help reduce crime rates? And if so, how do they do it? One place where this is coming up is the alarm around carjackings in the last 18 months or so, and the statistics suggesting that kids are often the ones being caught and arrested for these carjackings. So the Hennepin County Attorney's Office has gotten some flack from suburban police departments and other areas for a perception that they are not taking carjackings seriously enough. And that call that I started this conversation with, that demand to be tough on crime, has risen in this context. There's also database suggestions that being tough is not necessarily what reduces crime. And so people have a right to ask the next candidate, what does it actually mean to reduce crime? And what is the county attorney's role in reducing recidivism? I think that's a long enough introduction for me. So I'm going to pass it back to Andy now. And I hope I've teed up what is really the exciting part of the conversation now, which is the folks who are coming next.
Thank you so much, Professor Moran. We appreciate the perspective that you've shared. To round out the context, I'd like to hand it over to Artika Roller of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and Zeke Caligiuri of the Minnesota Justice Research Center to provide a little context on how the work of county attorneys affects their membership. Artika and Zeke, over to you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Professor Moran, for your presentation. Hello, I am Artika Roller, the Executive Director of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, also known as MINCASA. For approximately 20 years, I have been working alongside victims and survivors of sex trafficking, relationship violence, child abuse, sexual violence, and I've been working with survivors for seeking justice, healing, and recovery. MINCASA is a statewide coalition driving transformative culture change to address sexual violence through advocacy, prevention, racial justice, and system change. MINCASA acts like a collective voice for over 66 organizations and individuals across the state of Minnesota, including in the 45 cities in Hennepin County. Our organizations are committed to ending sexual violence. Advocates publicly stand strong to address the needs of victims and survivors statewide. I'm honored to be a part of this critical community conversation about the role of the Hennepin County's Attorney's Office and how that role impacts victims and survivors of violence. Thank you to the Minnesota Justice Research Center, their executive director, Justin Terrell, for hosting this discussion, all of the panelists, speakers, and candidates. MNCASA was born 45 years ago as a grassroots movement to address the issue of sexual violence in Minnesota. Our organization was created to serve as an accessible platform for victims and survivors and community to speak out about their experiences. We deeply believe that people who have experienced violence are the best experts on what is needed to prevent it and also to respond to it. The county attorneys have a critical role in promoting safety and well-being and justice for victims and survivors, ensuring there is an equitable system response. The county attorneys make decisions about many issues related to sexual and partner and relationship violence. They allocate resources, making charging decisions, including officer-involved violence and violence within the systems towards victims and survivors. The Hennepin County Attorney is responsible for upholding Crime Victims' Bill of Rights, ensuring that there is trauma-informed assistance to victims and survivors, and they set the tone for how victims and survivors are treated and have power to implement trauma-informed, culturally responsive policies and practices. We know that Brown and Black and Indigenous people are disproportionately arrested, charged, convicted, incarcerated by the state of Minnesota. In addition, research also shows that Black and Brown victims are not believed, they're criminalized, they're traumatized through practices like multiple Spriggle witness subpoenas that are not related to their case, without trauma support and services and confidentiality practices adhered to. The Hennepin County Attorney has the ability to interrupt and disrupt racialized pathways and practices to criminalization by making equitable charges and decisions and plea agreements. To set the tone for this conversation today, I invite you to imagine with me a world where victims and survivors and folks that are impacted by the legal system can access a multitude of pathways to justice and healing, not only one. A world where communities work together to prevent violence and to repair harm. A world where all victims and survivors receive an equitable, trauma-informed system response. Everyone in our community deserves access to a system that they can trust and that they can use. I look forward to hearing from all the participants today and see how they envision this coming true to life. Thank you again, and excited about the conversation today. I will turn it over to Zeke.
I am Zeke Caligiuri. I am the Reentry Education Coordinator for MNJRC. I am also a newly returned homecomer from long-term incarceration. I grew up here in South Minneapolis, in the same neighborhood that my father grew up. I'm a part of the generation of kids who came of age in the 1990s, which was the last time the unforgiving rhetoric around criminality was used to increase sentencing and justify the caging of young human beings as a response to an increase in violent crime. We are a generation that was so deeply impacted during the over-aggressive sentencing practices of the 1990s and 2000s. One of the many times in our history when fear has been egregiously politicized for the gains of certain people and systems. A socioeconomic matrix that has disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities and so often punishes the poor for the conditions of their poverty. We come to the table as a community, hyper aware of the county attorney as an office that has caused immeasurable harm to our people and communities. When many of us think of the county attorney's office, we think of how in so many instances our humanity was disregarded in place of an over-politicized view of crime and punishment. When I was incarcerated, I was a part of a culture within those prisons of artists and organizers and caretakers of one another who were all aware of our very real but also very dormant humanity. It was that awareness that so many of us used to overlook the labels we were given as offenders, as monsters, a term so casually used by prosecutors. We spent decades eating substandard food you would never feed your own children, and following nominal rules meant only to simplify the overpopulation in those institutions, a system that the pandemic only made worse. Now we are a homecoming community of people coming out of those places, an array of successes and successes unable to launch because of policies and practices enacted out of fear in the last 30 years. When you see me and the other panelists, I want you to see human beings, what people look like when you let them out of those facilities after all those years and you have to face them. I want you to know that we all remember how those places felt. We all remember what it meant to be thrown away, to have our humanity disregarded by a prosecutor whose primary aim was to win at all costs, despite our families or our capacity to be better human beings. We are those who have felt the greatest harms associated with the power of the county attorney's office. So when you answer these questions, I want you to be aware of the long-term trauma incurred through the practices of the criminal legal system and by the county attorney's office during the last 30 years in this state. When you send people away, you are sending them to facilities that exacerbate previously existing poverty, mental illness, financial disparities, as well as disparities in healthcare and education. Through the deprivation, they are places that paralyze personal growth and development, create ongoing trauma that, depending upon the amount of time, lasts throughout a person's lifetime. And that this trauma then gets passed along to families and children who carry the same burdens. We are currently watching the generation of children born out of Minnesota's mass incarceration, and in many instances trying to overcriminalize them in the same ways they did to the generation of their parents. We are also aware of the county attorney's office as being historically disproportionately better funded than public defender's office. Justice is not a game to be won or lost in a courtroom. We want to know that if you're elected, you're not going to institute practices that will further perpetuate the harm in these communities that was exacted for decades by this office, or if you will take the failed example of the last 30 years and use that office to approach the complexities of harm and punishment in ways that are restorative and offer diversion from the false promises of a prison cell. That you will not continue to use such insurmountable sentences to leverage each other against each other just so that you can win. That holds law enforcement accountable when it should be. But knowing that simply throwing bad apples into a cage doesn't do anything to heal the injuries that over-incarcerating our people for several generations has created. Putting people in cages has never made our society safer. Instead, it has put mothers and fathers and sons and daughters into a gauntlet of financial insecurity and exploitation and a pressure cooker of trauma and anger and abandonment without the support to process it within those places or upon their release from them. Know also that we are a community that is committed to creating safer communities, that love our community and want to reduce harm created by the violence in our cities. We support Ms. Roller and her people because we know we are intertwined in this together. Conversations around justice and accountability should always include us all. So often, our human experience means we live in both worlds at the same time. But also, we want a safer community that does less to harm all of its citizens. We just don't believe you need longer sentences and an increased carceral footprint to create it. If I'm able to impress upon you one more point more than any other, it says as this election nears and you're speaking of a narrative of violence and public safety, we want people to understand that stuffing a human being into a cage for years of that person's life is violence, and ongoing violence that stifles hope and leaves lasting consequences upon the family members of those who are put in those places. Thank you. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for that powerful context, Zeke and Artika. I think that demonstrates the criticality of this election, the criticality of this office. And I too am really looking forward to the conversation. With that, I'd like to invite our first candidate, Martha Holton Dimick, to join the conversation. And if it's okay with you, Artika and Zeke, I'd love to ask you to introduce our panelists as we go through. And Zeke, if it's okay with you, we'll start with you introducing panelists once we have Martha.
I'm here.
Excellent.
Thank you for inviting me to join this robust discussion. And I look forward to participating and answering your questions to the best of my ability.
Excellent. Zeke, do you want to introduce Kevin?
Absolutely. We're going to bring to the panel now Kevin Reese. Kevin Reese is somebody that I've known for many years. Spent quite a bit of his time organizing and advocating for people within the criminal legal system who don't otherwise necessarily have that voice, and help to amplify their voices as well. It's an honor to be able to bring him to the table.
Well, I want to start with first, thanks to the MNJRC for holding this space. It's a really important space to create this bridge for us to be able to even have these kind of conversations, because there are so many folks in community that, like, you know, electoral races and politics like happen to them. They don't see that, feels like that it happens for them or with their voices being involved. Me being a person who don't have a vote, right, but have a huge stake in community. I'm from here as well too. So who's the future prosecutors of Hennepin County is something that means a lot to me and an entire sector of the community that I know and I vibrate with and vibrate within. So I appreciate y'all for holding this space, and shout out to the candidates for saying yes to come to this space this close to the election to be asked these real questions from community. So I'll just get right into it. So my first questions for you would be, what is your stance on the punitive versus restorative model when it comes to holding our community members, specifically our youth, accountable for their actions?
You know, I'm very concerned about our youth, our children, I'd like to refer to them as. We have a problem in the juvenile justice system with respect to what we do with these children that are committing some of these crimes that we see now. Particularly, I think the focus right now in many of these communities is on the carjacking issue. Well, what happened that kind of prevented or put a hamper on how we address these issues is they closed the county home school without having an alternative. And in St. Paul, they closed the totem house without having an alternative. And when I say an alternative place to place these children on a temporary basis so that they can get the resources that they so desperately need, and that would be dealing with trauma in their homes, dealing with mental health issues, chemical dependency issues, and any other issues that we identify as causal factors in their current behavior. This to me is extremely important. We also need to have them in an environment that puts them in their community, with the community that we want them to re-enter into. And that is very important. I am a huge proponent of alternatives to incarceration, and we do need that desperately for our children. Right now, unfortunately, they're being sent to Red Wing and unfortunately to someplace in Utah. I don't see how that works for our children in their best interests, because the family's not involved. The family can't be involved. They can be involved if they're in the community in which where they committed the crime. So we can coordinate with the family and the community, their reentry. After, of course, we address the issues that they're struggling with. I am also a proponent of pre-plea diversion and post-plea diversion. After a person completes a program, maybe it's for 6 months with some conditions directed toward their behavior, or for a year, they have nothing on their record. And this helps in terms of their future, in terms of education, in terms of employment, and also in terms of any future contacts that they might have with law enforcement, because law enforcement always looks back to see what the person's history is. So there are a lot of things that we can do to assist our children in going down the right path. I'm also very interested in preventative measures and intervention. And when I talk about preventative measures, I mean we need to be in the middle schools and in the high schools with specific programs to teach these children how to respect themselves and each other, and also to give them enough mentorship or direction in how to go down the right path, get a job, have a family, etc. I think it's very important for prosecutors to be in these schools, dealing with the administration, dealing with the teachers, social workers, whatever it takes. We have to get together and collaborate and work on what is in the best interest of these children. I'm very, very concerned now that we aren't doing the right thing for our children.
Thank you so much, Ms. Holton Dimick. Artika, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce the next panelist and then ask you and Zeke just to take turns, if that's okay, and I'll stay out of your way.
Sounds good, Andy. Thank you. Next on our panel is Alla Hassan. Alla is a advocate for people who have experienced sexual violence and intimate partner violence. She also serves her community as a board member and member of task force as well. Alla, please ask the next question.
Thank you so much, Artika, and thank you everyone for being part of this conversation today, the candidates, the panelists, and everyone. The question I have is, as you may know, the Minnesota SAKI project, the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, addresses the accumulation of sexual assault kits using victim, survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and collaborative practices. What would it mean to you to be victim-centered, trauma-informed, and collaborative in your role as county attorney responding to sexual assault cases, whether they are sexual assault kit initiative related or not?
Okay, this is an area, when I was a Hennepin County attorney, this is, and good morning, Alla. This is an area that I practiced in as a Hennepin County attorney. I did date rape cases. So I did sexual assaults where the individual was either under the influence of alcohol and was unable to give consent, or was drugged with GHB or Rohypnol. And I did these cases back in the early 2000s. We were not doing very well with these cases because once a lot of our evidence was lost after the person had their first urination. And many of these women didn't even know they had been drugged, so they wouldn't know to save that evidence. What I did was I found an expert in the community who was an expert on sexual assaults that were promoted by the use of GHB or Rohypnol. And I found this expert and used him as an expert in court. And what he did was he was able to testify as to the symptomatology. What do you see in a person who is under the influence of drugs or alcohol or whatever? He was able to present a PowerPoint to the jurors to explain to them exactly what symptoms you would look for in a person who was drugged. And as a result of his testimony, the county attorney's office was successful in getting a number of individuals who were using this drug convicted and sent to prison. The reason I emphasize these particular cases is because as a result of prosecution, aggressive prosecution, you send a message to the communities that are doing this. You send the message to people who are hanging out at clubs and drugging women's drinks when they're not looking. And we saw a drastic decrease in these cases. So in this instance, with respect to these particular cases, we were very successful. And as far as our victims, we have victim advocates. I know they still have victim advocates in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office who work very closely with these victims, who give them as much support as they possibly can. And I've worked with these victims on a regular basis also. You get to a point where you're almost developing a relationship with them before trial. You want to gain their confidence. You want to reassure them that you believe them, that you support them. We know how difficult the situation is that they just encountered. So it's so important for us to have that support within the office, but also that we have attorneys that are very, very understanding and compassionate in dealing with these victims. So I am totally in support of any kind of programming that's out there, or therapy, or whatever it takes to assist these women, or these sometimes these cases don't just involve women, but we want to support them to the fullest extent that we can, and we'll continue to do so.
Again, thank you so much, Ms. Holton Dimick. Before I hand it back to Zeke to introduce the next panelist, I'd just like to reemphasize the point that all of our panelists are impacted by the criminal justice system, either as survivors or as people otherwise impacted by the criminal justice system. So Zeke, do you mind just introducing the next panelist or asking her to introduce herself? Thank you.
I have no problem introducing her. I'm sure she will introduce herself certainly well. It's an honor to be able to bring April Bryant. She's done some volunteer work with us around the consent decree and has some really, really powerful things to say. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you all for your time today. I do want to start with honoring that I am on Lakota land right now, and I'm very honored to be here. Serendipitous. Today is a day where I returned to an employer that I wasn't able to work at, being under DHS. Old regulations because of having a felony. And now that it has been expunged, I am able to be back and be able to make a way to be employed. And so I want to say that serendipitous, it's also a very vulnerable space, and I'm having a very visceral reaction to the past 16 years of my life, but also excited to look forward to an opportunity to change the guard and to look at ways where we can improve spaces for those that, again, have been impacted by their own actions and impacted by sexual assault by others. So I'll get to my question, and it is, how are you planning to change policies, procedures, and or culture of the office to focus on harm reduction and more, become more trauma informed? Because again, as my body is responding today, the trauma of the impact of the system lives with me. And then also, how are you going to change the definition of success for your department to include diversion and healing and not only harsh sentencing? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. April, that's very, very important to me also within the county attorney's office. I know the culture. I was there back in the late 90s through 2009. And I do understand what you're talking about with regards to the culture. A lot of emphasis has been placed on winning a case instead of. And I talked with, not too long ago, a number of county attorneys that are currently working there. And I said, well, what do you get, what do you get credit for? How do you get credit now? And winning is a big issue. I want to see more emphasis placed on work within the community, preventative help, working within the schools. I want people to get credit for being in the community, working with the community, working with the schools, working with advocates. I want them out there letting people know that we work for them. And I don't want the emphasis placed on how many cases you win. It's nice to have a successful conviction if there's enough evidence and the proof is there and it goes through the court system. It's good to have a good, outcome if that's justice. But we have to make sure that justice isn't just about winning. Justice also is all about making sure we have enough evidence there to prove a case and to make sure that we have the right person. So, and I know that this is vitally important to the community. Another thing that I want to expand on is expungements. And I'm really glad to hear that your case was expunged so that you could get back into the community. We are working, I shouldn't say we, but I know the county attorney's office has one dedicated prosecutor who works on this. We're trying to make the process easier for those individuals who qualify for an expungement. We're trying to, when I say easier, probably remove the court from having to appear in court to get this done, to just having one of the prosecutors in the office walk you through the process, because the process is quite complicated if you look at the statute. I get kind of confused when I look at it and I don't work on it on a regular basis. So we're trying to make that process easier for people who do qualify, because there are specific crimes that are not expungible, but for the most part, those crimes, there are some alternative ways of at least getting it off your record so that it doesn't show up when they're running a background check for employment. So that's something that I think is very, very positive, because I know a felony record does affect your ability to get a job, housing, education. It is a huge detriment in those areas. And that's something that I want to expand on and do more for.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing Comfort Dondo. Comfort is the founder, president, and CEO of Milani, Minnesota African Women Against Violence. Comfort, would you like to ask the next question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Minnesota Coalition, Minkasa, and thank you, hosts, and also panelists as well as participants. As I was listening to my sister April sharing congratulations, sharing her victory today, which is steeped in a lot of pain and trauma. I can't even imagine. I was thinking about the Audre Lorde quote that says that there's no thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. And I was also thinking about my journey as a survivor, as a childhood survivor, and how some of those invisible pains then trickle into adulthood, and how the lack thereof of including restorative practices causes more harm than good. And so with that being said, I'm very thankful to be here. And my question to you is many victims and survivors of sexual assault with unsubmitted, untested kids have been waiting for decades for any kind of evidentiary testing or some kind of resolution to their cases. What do you believe are the factors that led to this accumulation? If you're unsure of the answer, maybe I would also go on to add and ask, what will you do to learn more about this accumulation of unresolved sexual assault cases in the state, and particularly in Hennepin County? Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Comfort. I don't know the specific reasons. I am aware of the fact that there is a backlog in these test kits. And I don't know how far back they go, All I can say right now is that with a reduction in the Minneapolis Police Department, in terms of their investigations and the investigators, they are at an all-time low with investigators. And I'm wondering if maybe that might have an impact, but I don't know how far back the backlog goes. And I'm talking about recently the loss of the 300 police officers. And in that loss was a number of investigators. I know that they are calling back, and I just recently learned of this, that they are calling back people who have retired from the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the BCA. When they retire, they're like in their 50s, you know, maybe even in their early 60s, and asking them to come back and transition into these investigative positions. I think some of these individuals were investigators for the BCA, and now they're trying to recruit them to go over to the MPD and assist with the investigations there. I know that they're behind in not only investigating sexual assault cases, but they're also behind in investigating other cases, including some of the recent homicides. And so I know that they're trying to put together a group of people that would go over and assist them with these investigations. I know the U.S. Attorney's Office is also weighing in and trying to assist with those issues. So that's what I can tell you. I will work very, very hard on making sure I understand what's going on, what is the process, and what are some of the what are some of the things that we can do to resolve the backlog. I do agree with you that these are very extremely traumatic cases, and I know how traumatic they are, not only to the individual who has gone through a sexual assault, but also with their family, their lives, the upheaval, the moving on to, you know, with your relationships with your children, your, you know, with others in the community. I know how difficult and how traumatizing these cases can be. So I will work diligently to understand the backlog and to try to work on seeing if we can resolve it, or at least get it, catch up, if so to speak.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I am really excited to be able to introduce Cynthia Jackson. She's a woman I have a great deal of respect for. I see her in community all the time. And so welcome, Cynthia.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I am just so excited to be able to participate in this, and welcome, Martha, and thank you for your willingness to be here to talk about these important issues with us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I try to serve my community the best I can. I'm the former chair of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission in the Department of Civil Rights for the City of Minneapolis, and I'm now serving on the board of directors for the Minnesota Second Chance Coalition. Everyone else has had such marvelous things to say, and I'm kind of tongue-tied at the moment, so I'm just going to get straight to the question. What, in your opinion, are the one or two strategies that are most effective for violence prevention?
Back when I was hired at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, I was hired as the community prosecutor, and by Amy Klobuchar, and I, in my role as the community prosecutor, this was in 1999, towards the tail end of the Murderapolis years, so to speak. I collaborated with law enforcement then, with the police inspector at the 4th Precinct, with the Hawthorne Huddle, group of business individuals who were very concerned about what was happening in our communities. I also collaborated with community groups, neighborhood organizations, churches, mosques, and you name it, we collaborated with anyone who wanted to get involved in assisting our community. And we were able to have eyes on the streets 365 days of the year. And this was when we had a full complement of police officers. By the time that I left the office in 2009, we had brought the crime level down in North Minneapolis to such an extent that the police department got a national award, and primarily the crime reduction that they were focused on in the award was the juvenile crime level. When I left the office in 2009, we had only 7 homicides in North Minneapolis. Now, I've lived in North Minneapolis for 20 years. And then last year we had 46, and we're climbing this year in just North Minneapolis. So, and this is what really prompted me to retire as a judge, because I thought I could do more for my community off the bench than I could on the bench. And I believe we can do the same thing again. I voted no on that ballot, as did many of my community members here over north, in terms of replacing the police department, so to speak. And I voted no because I know we need a police department, but we need good officers. And we need officers that are in tune with our communities. Back in the day, we had officers walking the streets, getting to know people, getting to know the communities, getting to know the bad actors, and also putting a damper on people committing crimes. We had that ability to do that. We can't do that right now because we're so depleted. I also believe that it's very important for me to collaborate with all of our justice partners. I'm talking about the Department of Corrections, probation, the commissioners, the county administrator, you name it. I have had relationships with these people, and very positive relationships with these people in the 25 years that I've been in public service. So, and I know it worked back then. I know it can work and again, but we need everybody involved in this. We can't just we can no longer afford to point fingers and place blame. We need to work together and come up with some viable solutions to help our community. I did it once before, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I believe I can do it again, and we can do it again. But I said I collaborated with everyone I could get involved.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing next Sam Schmitt. Sam is the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Project Coordinator with MNCASA, also a professor and a starch advocate for accessibility justice. So I welcome you, Sam, to ask the next question.
That kind introduction, Artika, and I'm grateful to be here in collaboration with my community members and the candidates on today's panel. I have a question for you, Ms. Dimick. Victim survivors often experience multiple forms of traumatization beyond a single incident of sexual assault, and that might include harm caused by racism, poverty, and negative encounters with police and the criminal legal system. And the trauma experienced by the community has, as we know, led for calls for greater integration of victim survivor voices and alternatives to the criminal legal resolution. If elected to the position of Hennepin County Attorney, what would your response be to victim survivors of sexual assault who experienced harm from law enforcement? What would be your role in responding to the community's request for alternatives to criminal legal responses to sexual assault?
Okay, and could you expound a little bit for me, Sam, in terms of what type of trauma we're talking about when we're talking about police trauma? Is that in the investigation process, or if you could?
And Artika and other members from MNCASA, feel free to chime in as well, since we are all collaborative on this question. And when we say trauma, there's a couple of ways to think about it. There's trauma from the incident of having a negative experience with a law enforcement officer, particularly if you occupy a marginalized position, being LGBTQ, being disabled, being Black, Indigenous, Asian American, being non-white. There are lots of ways that people experience marginalization, and that affects their encounters with police. And the trauma that's experienced going through an investigation, retelling your story over and over, and having that investigation shaped by who you are and how you're perceived by law enforcement officers. And then the trauma, of course, of all the systemic barriers you have to having an equitable participation in public life, like not having housing, not having mental health care, et cetera. There's trauma in multiple forms, multiple levels happening. So my question about trauma is people are saying they don't maybe want the trauma of the law enforcement system to be added to the trauma they're already experiencing. What would be your response to some of those critiques?
Well, I recently, and I have in the past, one marginalized group of people are women who are out in the community engaging in sex for hire, okay? And I've represented a number, well, I shouldn't say represented, but I've handled cases of a number of them coming with allegations of rape. And the reluctance that they have of even going to the police and reporting it because of the conduct that they engage in. And I had a recent case that was similar, that of course included a person with this background. And this person was in a church environment when she first reported. She ran to a church and she got she called the police from the church. When the police responded, they were very, very careful in terms of how they handled her and paid very close attention to what she was reporting. I would like to see more women in those responsive capacities when we have a situation like that, doing the questioning. But I found the way that she was treated to be very, very sensitive. Now that's nowadays. I know some of this trauma goes way back, and this is just something when people become more aware of the differences and some of the backgrounds of the victims. When police departments, when county attorneys, when defense attorneys become more aware of the distinction and the special needs that, you know, these people are entitled to have, some of the people that are different than what, the society is used to, so to speak. We need to be very much aware of how important it is to see the person and not anything else. Now, I was very impressed with the way this young lady was handled and taken care of. I also was impressed with the follow-up care that she was referred to for what she went through by the county attorney's office, by that office. I was on the bench at the time, so I was the judge that caught the case. So I got a chance to get a lot of this background information. And I will continue as the next county attorney to make sure that the county attorneys that deal with these types of cases have the proper training in terms of being compassionate, asking the right questions, not asking questions that are going to make a person feel extremely uncomfortable outside of course, the information that we need in order to prosecute a case. But yes, I'm very much aware of the fact that there are a lot of young people and people out there who have not been treated very well at all by police officers when they report criminal sexual conduct cases. I've seen the cases and I've seen how they've been treated.
Thank you.
And I'm not going to let that happen.
Thank you.
I'm
Zeke,
not going to let that continue to happen.
We're going to try to sneak one more question in, Zeke, before we let Ms. Holton Dimick go.
Okay, well, we're gonna bring Kevin Reese back in to ask her one more question then. Kevin.
What is an example of mistakes that you've made as an attorney or in the criminal legal system that you learned from?
Let's see. I would say, I wouldn't really call it a mistake, but when I was a young, not a young, because I was never young when I became a prosecutor. I had already been a nurse for a number of years. But anyway, when I first started in the county attorney's office, I had a case And I think I've shared this before, and I've been criticized by social media, but I had a case where an officer brought a defendant in, or a suspect in, being accused of a 4th-degree assault. That's an assault against a police officer. And the police officer had a scratch on his arm, okay? For some reason, before I proceeded to determine whether there were charges to be had, for some reason, and I never did this before, I wanted to see the booking photo of the suspect. I saw the booking photo of the suspect, excuse me, and he was beaten up pretty badly. And I thought at the time, this was in the late 90s, and I knew what a lot of the complaints had been against the police department with regards to the brutality of some of the arrests. I had heard about that, plus we'd seen a number of cases like that. And I called the officer back to my office, and I, rather than do, and if I would have reported it, I don't know if anything would have happened. I just don't know if anything would have happened. My decision was not to charge the case. And I told the officer, instead of accusing him, you know, what did you do to him, or confronting him, I just looked at him and said, I can't charge your case because by the time we get, if it goes to trial, I have to show a demonstrable injury, and what you're showing me isn't sufficient. And so that was the excuse I used not to charge the case. Now, would I do it any differently now? Yes, I would do it very differently now. I would report the situation, depending on what the charges are that are brought before us. I would make sure that there was follow through. I would identify the police officers that were involved, report it to the Minneapolis Police Department, and I would follow up on any disciplinary action. I wouldn't just leave it there on their doorstep. Kevin, would want to know what they're going to do with those officers with respect to their misconduct. In any way, if we can see this beforehand, then we can make a decision on how we can proceed, whether or not those charges are going to be put forth, if you understand what I'm saying. That, to me, I wouldn't call it a mistake. I think it was just my reaction at that time. We've got how many years since that time? We've got almost 25 years since then, and we've seen a whole lot. A lot of things have changed, you know, in terms of police work and police relations. I would act very differently now. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining this conversation today, Ms. Holton Dimick. I think we've had a really good, interesting talk, and we're extremely grateful to you for joining. And I think right now we'll shift gears and ask Ms. Mary Moriarty.
If I could just say something before I go and direct this at Zeke.
Sure.
Zeke, I have been in contact with the Department of Corrections, and I am a huge proponent of making sure people, you know, people that are in prison get the right resources so that when they come out, they're going to be able to be introduced back into society. I think there are a lot of programs out there where we're trying to reacclimate people who come out of prison, have them prepared to come back into society, have them welcome back into society, have jobs set aside for them. It's got to be, but like I said, it's got to be an organized effort by everyone. And that's one thing that I really do truly believe in. And I will be working on that effort also to the extent that I can.
Thank you so much, Ms. Holton Dimick. We
Okay.
appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you. I'd like to now invite Ms. Mary Moriarty to join the conversation. And as soon as she gets on, Zeke, I'll let you kick off again, if that's okay.
I think it's Mikasa.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay, Andy. That's all right. All right, thank you. At this time, I will turn it over to Alla Hassan to ask the next question.
Do we have Ms. Moriarty on?
Oh, yes, she's on.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Artika. Thank you, Mary, for joining us. My question to you is, the Sexual Assault Response Team, also known as SART, is comprised of members who work to coordinate an immediate, quality, multidisciplinary, victim-centered response to sexual assaults in a community. This response prioritizes the needs of sexual assault victims. The County Attorney's Office appoints leadership to SART teams. What would be your policy and key criteria for appointing someone from your office to this critical work?
Thank you for inviting me to be here today. And I also want to acknowledge what I imagine to be the difficulty of all of you being here, sharing your lived experience. I honor that, I respect that, and I know it can be really difficult. I've listened a lot to people about how victims of sexual assault have been treated by the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. Some of it surprised me, some did not. What I heard loud and clear was from many different people that the County Attorney's Office does not communicate well with people who come in on sexual assaults. They don't communicate, they don't prepare them for trial, so that people don't actually know what they're heading into. They're not talked to and prepared for what questions the prosecutor is going to ask them, what kind of questions the defense lawyer is going to ask them. And when I heard that, and I kept hearing it over and over and over, and when I first heard it, it shocked me because it seemed as a lawyer as malpractice when you are trying a case not to prepare a witness. But it also struck me as extremely cruel. I can't imagine being a witness in that position, not having communication about what was happening with your case, any proposed settlement, and preparing you for your case. In terms of the SART teams, I think it's really important to have staff from the County Attorney's Office who understand trauma. And I think it comes as no surprise to any of you on this call that the system is not very good at understanding trauma at all. Trauma is something I can tell you as a public defender for 31 years was rarely ever talked about when I was a public defender. And so what we need is a representative or leadership on that group where we have people educated in trauma, educated about sexual assault, of partner sexual assault. There are many different types of sexual assault. People who listen to what victims actually need and want. One of the things I find with prosecutors, and I found for years, is that they often just decide what victims want instead of actually asking them what they want and need. And many of those their decisions are made for political reasons and what will look good, not what the person who's been harmed actually wants. So I want somebody there who is trauma informed, understands culturally specific issues that can come up, shame and stigma, all of those issues, and can be a leader in talking about how these cases can be successfully prosecuted and how we can better communicate and how we can better make this path towards people who come into the process, because we actually know that many people, probably a majority of people who are sexually assaulted, never report it to the system because they don't want what the system has to offer. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to bring April back to ask her question. April.
All right. Thank you for being here, Ms. Moriarty. I appreciate it. And my question is, what are your thoughts about MDHR consent decree to address race-based policing in Minneapolis and the new standards of conduct for officer licensure. Both are being negotiated by the end of the year. So as a prosecutor, do you support these efforts to address police misconduct and also how it impacts communities? Thank you.
Yes, and in fact, when I was chief public defender, our office and I participated in interviews with the Department of Human Rights. Because as public defenders, we saw the video a lot. I saw many interactions between police officers and community members. So public defenders, and by the way, prosecutors, are probably the people that see those day-to-day interactions more so than police leadership. If we are to regain trust in the community, and let me take a step back. We know in Hennepin County, we have a public safety issue in many different respects. And part of that comes from the loss of trust in our police force. The only way that that can begin to be created is if police officers are held accountable, just as community members are held accountable. And I've seen a tremendous failing in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office over the years as a public defender. I've watched video after video where I have not seen the county attorney. I've seen the county attorney's office continue to charge cases where police have lied. And I can give you an example of one. There was a police officer from Corcoran, small town out in western Hennepin County, who had 6 cases thrown out for violating people's constitutional rights, and by 5 different judges, and 2 of those judges found that he lied under oath. Yet the county attorney's office, who has the discretion to charge or to choose not to charge those cases, kept charging his cases. The last case, the police officer was on the stand under oath, and the public defender said to him, "Are you aware that you've had 5 cases thrown out by judges for violating people's constitutional rights?" His answer was, "Yes, I am. I disagree with them." Under oath to a judge. This was a police officer who had been called, by the way, by an assistant Hennepin County attorney. It may be no surprise that that judge threw out that case as well. And after that case, supervisors from my office, because I was chief public defender at the time, met with supervisors from the county attorney's office and said, "What are you going to do about this guy?" Their answer was, "We're not his employer. We're not his employer." That to me is a tremendous abdication of responsibility and a missed opportunity. I did, as many of you know, commentary on the Chauvin trial, and national media came here and said to me, one of the questions they often asked was, "How did the Minneapolis Police Department get to be this way?" And I said, "It is because prosecutors and judges have looked the other way for decades." So I think it's critical for the county attorney's office to step up and play the role it needs to play in helping hold police officers accountable. If that doesn't happen, there will never be any beginning to build trust in the Minneapolis Police Department, which also means it will be much harder to solve crimes. We know the closure rate for MPD is very low. And a part of that is lack of trust and people not really wanting to work with them. So there are many different aspects of accountability. I've been following the process of the negotiation of the consent decree. I look forward to the hoping that a consent decree is agreed to, and I will be an active participant in trying to implement what they recommend.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Comfort. Dondo.
Thank you, Artika. Ms. Moriarty, it's good to meet you. My question for you is around some advocates who solely either want to focus on the criminal justice system and or those who want to focus on the reform perspective that is more survivor focused. What is your focus? Do you think that it is possible to take a balanced approach to either of these?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And I do think that as a public defender for over 31 years, I represented people who, when I did social histories, had been victimized at a very young age. And I often wondered if we had intervened early back in their lives, they probably would not have been here sitting next to me. One of the things that I sometimes see with prosecutors is that they can sometimes see somebody that they would refer to as a perpetrator and somebody that they would refer to as a victim who has to be pristine, stereotypically pristine. And there's never anybody who's been harmed or a victim that then becomes somebody who victimizes somebody else. And I know that's not how life works. I know that's not how life works at all. And so many of the people I represented had so much trauma and had been victims. And so, yes, we can do away with the practices, the failed practices of the past decades at the county attorney's office and have a public health approach to violence, a public health approach to how we treat our youth, which can be centered on healing of both those people who've been harmed and those people who are responsible for the harm. I believe that that's very much possible. And one of the reasons my candidacy is so important is that I know that's possible, and those are things that I will implement, even though those aren't the traditional tough on crime kinds of things that you often hear from people. I was listening to the presentation, I signed on early, and Rachel was talking about the tough on crime rhetoric, that kind of thing, and how prosecutors have operated for decades and decades and decades. And we all know what they've done has not worked to keep us safer. It has not worked in so many ways that have ripped apart families, that have meant that children of incarcerated parents are more likely to be in prison. It just hasn't worked. We need something different, and that something has to be a more healing approach. It has to be about accountability, but it also has to be about healing both the person harmed and the person responsible for that harm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Cynthia, if we could bring you in here to speak with Mary, please. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning or afternoon, rather, Miss Moriarty. It's good to
Hi,
see
Cynthia.
you.
Nice
Yeah,
to see you.
how are you?
I'm well.
Okay, I'm glad you're here. So non-criminal technical violations contribute to higher recidivism despite the individual not having committed a new crime. Do you believe that people on probation who have not committed a new crime should be in prison? And how would you ensure that people who have not committed new crimes are able to be held accountable to the community?
Yeah, what the system refers to as technical violations are really a critical issue in my mind. One thing that many people don't know is Minnesota has one of the highest percentages of people or numbers of people on probation in the country. And it used to be, I think, that came out of a feeling that Minnesota was somehow less punitive. And so the idea was we're putting more people on probation rather than putting them in prison. What people don't realize is how onerous being on probation is. You're kind of at the whim of your probation officer who may call you in for a drug test. You know, the way it sometimes works is you have to call in, you have a particular color. If your color purple comes up, you've got to get yourself in there and do a drug test. It means you have to have regular appointments with your PO. And the stress and the trauma of knowing that at any point your probation officer could have a warrant issued for your arrest and haul you in on a warrant, taking you away from your job, your family, your housing, and that they may be asking for you to go to prison is incredibly difficult. And so there's been a movement that hasn't gone nearly far enough. As county attorney, one thing I will do is really look at why are we putting people on probation? Does somebody need to be put on probation? What is the point of it? And right. Sorry, my cat is joining us here. And you know, I think prosecutors tend to just ask for numbers of years on probation that really aren't related to anything. And in my experience as a public defender, when I've gone back and said, hey, this client's doing really well, can we discharge them from probation? The answer I frequently got was no. And so we need to be looking at Why are we putting on people on probation? What are the conditions that we're making, the hoops that we're making them jump through, and do they make any sense at all? How many years are we asking somebody to be on probation? How do we make sure that we get them out of the system and uninvolved on probation earlier rather than later? So those are all critical things to me. And I do not believe that people should go to prison on technical violations. And by that, I mean, they're not committing new crimes. They may have missed an appointment with a probation officer or, missed something like that. So they're actually being criminalized for not following through on technical things, not breaking the law.
Thank you.
And then next we will have Sam Schmitt.
Oh, and thank you again for inviting me to the panel. It's good to meet you. What is your experience serving victim survivors and people returning to the community from prison? What is the responsibility of the Hennepin County Attorney to our communities in that respect?
I wanted to talk a little bit about trauma because that's something that's been talked about a lot today. And it is fairly unrecognized in the criminal legal system. And one thing that we as a system need to do is to acknowledge the tremendous damage that the system has done, intentionally, actually, because of failed policies from decades and decades that haven't taken into account research on adolescent brain development and addiction and public health approaches to substance use and mental health. And so one of the best examples of this was actually in the Chauvin sentencing, where the judge found aggravated factors because children were present, but then in his sentencing memo said that he was not going to use that to enhance the sentence because he looked at the video and said that he saw no objective indicia of trauma by the young women. Now, I want to remind you that the two girls he was talking about were 9 and 17. They were Black girls, not young women. And I'm hard pressed to imagine anybody calling a 9-year-old white girl a young woman. But more than that, it was about the complete misunderstanding of trauma and how it manifests itself in people who are in the system. And it's so critical because, Keith Ellison did file to have the judge correct what the judge had said and filed an affidavit from a psychologist who said that laughing and giggling is indicia of trauma. And the issue is that so many times prosecutors will look at somebody who's in the system, whether they are a person who's charged or a person who's been victimized, and they will perceive certain behaviors as indifference or lack of respect or something that it really isn't, where it really is a manifestation of trauma. And that then leads to decisions that probably mean that people are more likely to get harsher consequences. So I have taken a lot of time to study trauma so that I understand it. I understand how it impacts people. And one of the really important things for me as Hennepin County Attorney is to make sure that staff understand trauma as well. However, I'm going to talk a little bit about Kevin Reese. Hi, Kevin. The idea, we do have a responsibility to help people return from prison, but you know what? We even have more of a responsibility to make sure that people shouldn't be in prison who don't belong there. And I look at Kevin. I met Kevin several years ago when we were both on a panel. I think, Kevin, you had just gotten out of prison, and we were on a panel with Elizabeth Warren. And I heard your story, and it stuck with me. And it is one of the reasons why I decided, you know what, I really do want to run for Hennepin County Attorney, because Kevin was indicted on first-degree felony murder, where when he was a teenager, he went on a drug deal. The person he was with had a gun and ended up killing somebody. He did not have a gun. He did not kill anybody. Yet Kevin Reese, as a teenager, was looking at going to prison for life without parole. because of the decision that the county attorney made to prosecute him that way. He ultimately did go to prison for 22 years, spent 15 years in prison. And I think of the power and the control of the county attorney and the discretion. And I know that I would not have indicted Kevin Reese on felony murder at all. Kevin Reese would not have gone to prison had I been Hennepin County attorney. Because I don't believe in sending people, especially teenagers, to prison for crimes that they did not do. And so I think about that, and I think about how we can do better. We can reject the past failed policies where we talk about, well, we have to treat people who go to prison better when they get out. Yes, but why are we sending certain people to prison in the first place? And in terms of diversion, what about pre-charge diversion? So somebody doesn't even have a charge on their record, because it's very hard to get charges expunged at times. And it's very easy with data miners for jobs, housing, landlords to find out that you do have a conviction. And so let's focus on practices that rehabilitate people, which will keep us safer, practices that do less damage to our community members and their families, while also holding people accountable. We can do that. But we need to reject the fear mongering, we have to get tougher on crime, and we need to understand that there are data-based, research-based approaches that do work, and we have to be behind those changes. Thank you.
Now I'll bring Kevin in to ask you something himself. Yeah. All right.
Good afternoon, Mary. How are you?
Hi, Kevin.
Running a marathon. I see you. Thank you for bringing a little bit of my story into the space, because I'm grounded in this, and I asked this question from this perspective. I am someone who was charged and convicted in Hennepin County. I remember on all of my paperwork, the Hennepin County's attorney, right, who was not the prosecutor on my case, but the county attorney name was on all of the paperwork. And the whole time while I was in prison, that name was on the paperwork. And this person was the one that said, this is in the interest of justice that Kevin Reese should be sentenced to 22 years to do his time for rehabilitation or whatever. And I remember coming home, since I've been in community, I've had an opportunity to be in community and be around this person. And it's always been so traumatizing where there is no acknowledgement of even who I am, what happened to me, right? That this person had an opportunity to decide not to charge Kevin Reese with felony murder. And that is always like it's like a link in the chain that's missing, that I did my time, I paid my debt to society. And when I came home, Hennepin County had no receipt for me, right? No acknowledgement of saying, okay, this person served their time. So my question to you would be, you kind of touched on it a little bit. I want to ask you around like how and what does it look like? What does it look like to support our community members transitioning out of prison as they come into the community from the Hennepin County's attorney's office?
It looks like acknowledgement, because I've talked about the failed policies of the past decades. I haven't mentioned the war on drugs, which was a war on brown and Black people, and caused tremendous damage. It is, and this is what you can expect from me, it is courageous leadership that focuses on data and research-based practices aligned with values, but that recognizes that when something is wrong, we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge the damage. I need to acknowledge, as a public defender and chief public defender, the damage that the system has done to so many people. And I hold that very dearly. I spent a lot of time when I was chief public defender in the community, listening to people about their experiences with the public defender. And I heard some things like, you're a bunch of public pretenders. And I understood that. I understood why people didn't trust government, didn't trust the legal system. And I would often walk up to them afterwards and say, I'm sorry you had a bad experience with a public defender. Would you mind telling me about that? And sometimes people would say, well, I've never had one. It's just what I think, what I've heard. But I understand that. And I understand that the county attorney, the person whose name was on your paperwork, needs to take accountability for the decisions that are made, damage that is done, and be accessible to the community. That means to me, if I become Hennepin County Attorney, I go back and I have people look at cases that were prosecuted in the 90s and 2000s, because I was trying cases then and I saw a lot of things that were wrong. Things that we now know and we see in Mayan Burrell's case and other people who were wrongfully convicted. So it is about acknowledging that everything wasn't okay. And the things that police and prosecutors and sometimes public defenders and probation officers did harm. And you can expect that from me. And so that's what it looks like to me, Kevin, and I'm never going to ignore somebody. I'm never going to, if I see somebody, not going to ask them how they're doing. I'm never going to run away and hide from people and not listen to them, even though I know they might be angry, because they have every reason to be angry. So this for me is about transparency. It's about accountability, and it's about accessibility. It's about compassion and understanding as well. It's also about my experience as a public defender and understanding that the people I represented are human beings. I just have to say, my opponent at one point called me a public defender who represented criminals. Think about that. Think about that language and how she perceives the people that I represented as a public defender. That's, for some reason, they're all criminals. Some of the people that I represented did things that they should not have done, that were harmful. That does not make them a bad person. That's not the sum of who they necessarily are. And I bring that empathy and compassion, and also the understanding that there has to be accountability, which can manifest itself in many different ways. And that's what we have to start exploring using evidence and database practices.
Okay. Next, we will have Alla Hassan.
Thank you. My question is, and Kevin, thank you for giving us a glimpse into your life. This is a great way to ask the upcoming question, which begins with: the host of this event, the Minnesota Justice Resource Center, often defines the key components of justice as fair, equitable, accountable, and restorative. Mary, what is your definition of justice?
That's actually something that I thought a lot about when I was doing commentary on the Chauvin trial. And certainly when you mention some of the things that the Minnesota Justice Research Center holds dearly in terms of justice also resonate with me. And when I think about them, they are definitely not things that I associate with the county attorney's office in many, many decades. First of all, you will hear people say that Minnesota has among the lowest incarceration rates in the country. What you will not hear is them complete that sentence and say that within those incarceration rates, we have among the highest racial disparities in the country. We have among the highest racial disparities in the country on practically every measure: health, equity, home ownership, income, education, you name it. And so racial inequity is a huge problem here. It's a huge problem in the county attorney's office, in that I have heard the current county attorney make presentations about their data dashboard, and he has said, well, you can see that there are racial disparities in terms of the people who are charged or who go to prison. Those aren't our fault. Those are the fault of police and schools. And I don't agree with that. Every part of the system perpetuates racial disparities, whether they intend to or not. I intend to measure the subjective decision-making, who gets charged, who doesn't get charged, or who gets diversion, who doesn't get diversion, by race and gender. And I would expect that there is the perpetuation of racial disparities, and that I will put in place policies to try to prevent those decisions from perpetuating those disparities. The criminal legal system is not restorative at all. When you looked, Rachel had a slide at the beginning about diversion. And that was generally the cases that the county attorney's office allows to go to diversion. But there are exceptions to that too. And it's very strict. It's first time cases under such and such a money, that kind of thing. I have a much more expansive view of diversion. I think people should be given more opportunities to go to diversion. The county attorney's office, by the way, announced a while ago that they would no longer be prosecuting marijuana cases. I actually heard the county attorney say that, and I went back to my office. I was chief public defender, and I sent an email to our staff saying, hey, guess what I heard? They're not going to charge marijuana possession. And suddenly people from the office started emailing me their marijuana possession cases and saying, what's going on with this? And so I contacted the county attorney and I said, did I misunderstand you? And he then told me there were a bunch of exceptions to that policy, including if you had a prior marijuana possession conviction. So the system is not restorative. It's not restorative. I have been in court, I can't tell you how many times, and heard victims give victim impact statements. And I've heard what they've asked for, and I've known that they're never going to have an opportunity to get it. And I know that restorative practices are something that many want. And we know how important those are, in part because the Department of Corrections actually has a restorative justice program, where they did before COVID started. And there was a long waiting list of people to get into that. So we need to start incorporating restorative practices before people go to prison. And also, I'll just end on this. We know, people in the community know, that there are two different systems. One that applies to Black and Brown people, and one that applies especially to police. And we need to have accountability. We need to have people held accountable, whether they are community members or police officers. And that is really critically important. And people know right now that that isn't really what's happening. Most of you probably know about the Jaleel Stallings case, where he got charged with attempted murder for firing some warning shots after he had been shot in the chest by a marking round. He ended up, he had a permit to carry a gun. When he found out it was actually the Minneapolis Police Department in an unmarked van, he threw his gun, gave himself up face first on the ground. We saw video of police officers running across the parking lot, kicking him in the face, and then beating him for 30 seconds in the head. They fractured his eye socket. And yet he got charged with attempted murder. He was acquitted. His lawyer tried to get the video released publicly. The county attorney's office opposed that, which I would never do. But they didn't want people to see what MPD had done to Jaleel Stallings, because people would be asking, how in the world did you ever charge Jaleel Stallings with attempted murder? Did you ever consider charging these police? But we, to this day, have no statement from the county attorney's office about why they made that decision, and do they stand behind it? So what I can promise you is, as county attorney, I will be fair. That means that people, no matter who they are, how much money they have, will be treated fairly. It won't be, we have to have a professional relationship with police officers, but they also have to be held accountable. And that I can promise you.
Thank you so much for sharing your vision with us, Ms. Moriarty. Again, it's a critical time for us, a critical conversation. We're grateful that you joined the conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me here. And it's been an honor and a privilege actually to hear many of your stories. So thank you for sharing.
Justin, you want to wrap us up?
Absolutely. If I'm feeling the weight of this conversation and the blessing of this conversation. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Comfort, Kev, Zeke, my brother, April, Cynthia, Alla, Artika, Sam. Thank you so much for being willing to hold this space and willing to hold these candidates accountable. create the space to talk about the impact of this office and where it needs to go. And so I'm forever thankful to you, and I'm excited to process this conversation afterwards if you can stay on. Mary, Martha, thank you for having the courage to run for office, for having the courage to run for office in a county that just so happens to be the epicenter of a global uprising. And so that should be, I just want to acknowledge that and say that we appreciate you. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us today. I have a few quick announcements. One, join us to continue this conversation at our conference this fall on November 16th and 17th. The Minnesota Justice Research Center will be hosting our annual Reimagining Justice Conference, and we'll hear from MacArthur Genius Fellow Desmond Meade, formerly incarcerated brother who's going to share a story about fighting for voting rights in Florida. Number two, we are on the phones. We are not a voter turnout organization by any means, but we know that there's 1 in 5 Minnesotans has a criminal record, which means there's 1 million Minnesotans out there who may not know that they're eligible to vote if they're off probation. And so you're interested in making a difference this election cycle, and picking a candidate has been too hard. Join us with some non-candidate work. So if I can get someone to drop the link to our From the Block to the Ballot initiative in the chat, we'll be out in community making those calls. And then if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to add it to your professional development, just know that we have submitted a CLE application. And if you're interested in applying for CLE for this conversation, please email us and we will give you those details. And then finally, I think those are all my announcements. Andy, Artika, Zeke, do you have anything else you'd like to share with the community?
Just my appreciation as well.
Thank you, Andy. It's a blessing to work with you, brother. Artika, Zeke, anything before we close out?
No, thank you. It's been an honor to serve in community with you, Justin, as well, and all the panelists. I would say that Mincasa, and I can send out the information, we'll have a symposium. Mia Mingus will be our keynote speaker on access and ability justice.
Thank you, Artika. Zeke, any final words?
And I would just reinforce what Artika said and thank the panelists and the candidates for making this work. Thank you.
Great. Then the last thing I'll do is just invite you to support these organizations. The work of Mincasa is so important. Several of us have organizations outside of the MNJRC, whether that's the Second Chance Coalition. Kev has several organizations he's a part of, and you've heard the associations from Comfort and Alla and Sam as well. And so please support the work of community folks. Man, we just normal folks trying to do the right thing, leaning into our expertise. And we know that if the world doesn't change, it ain't gonna be because of nothing we didn't do. Because all the folks on this call and the folks who tuned in today, I know that you're dedicated to justice. And so keep fighting, stay strong, and remember that the opposite of trauma is not wealth. The opposite of trauma is power. And if the opposite of poverty is not wealth, then the opposite of poverty is justice. And so join us as we work to build power to fight for justice. Thank you for your time today. Be blessed.